Welcome to Longterm. I'm Ty King, and I want to take you back to grade school. Remember being in class, and you have your instructor, you have your teacher in the front of the classrooms, and above all the coloring books and the picture books and the crafts, they would tell you, when you grow up, you can become anything you want to. You can accomplish anything you put your mind to, and it's still very true, even when you become an adult. But I don't think you realize how complicated that journey can be until you start becoming an adult and realize that, a simple prescription from the doctor can turn into a substance use disorder. And one bad life event can turn into deep depression, and losing someone you love can turn into an eating disorder. So, uh, recovery comes in so many different, shapes, sizes, forms, and it's different for every person and every individual. So, collecting these stories where we're learning along the way, what is recovery? How do we do this for ourselves? And how can we, unpack some of the things that could potentially be problems for ourselves, before they even happen, the preventative measures. So, one of the great things about doing this podcast is I get to meet really, really great people who have overcome something amazing. And so we get inspired by them and we learn about ourselves along the way. And so, Mallary Tenore Tarpley, I made sure to pronounce the middle name very correctly because I know people get it wrong a lot, right?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, yes. So Mallory is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas in Austin, where she teaches journalism class in the Moody College of Communications and writing classes at the McCombs School of Business. But her debut nonfiction book is coming out in August called Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. It explores the underdiscussed complexities of eating disorders and recovery from them. And so you have a personal story that goes along with writing that book, I assume.
Yeah, so I've always identified as a writer ever since I was a little girl. I knew I wanted to one day write a book, and I didn't quite know what that book would be, of course. But my book Slip is really a mix of my own personal narrative, along with lots of perspectives from other people with lived experience and also the latest research on eating disorders. And for me, I have lived experience with anorexia nervosa, which I developed after my mother died of metastatic breast cancer and was treated for many, many years and then tried to achieve the gold standard of full recovery and maintained that for a little while, about 2 years. But then in college, I relapsed and really felt ashamed of that relapse. And I continued to tell people I was fully recovered, even though I was very much silently struggling. And it wasn't until my mid 20s when I was working on helping journalists to tell more restorative narratives, which are essentially stories that help people and communities find meaningful pathways forward in the aftermath of trauma and tragedy, that I realized that this restorative narrative framework could be really helpful for my own story. And so I began to reframe my thinking around recovery around what I call the middle place, which is this name I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. And for me, I was really intrigued by this space because I'd never heard anyone talk about it. All of the books I'd read about eating disorders were written from the perspective of people who were fully recovered. And I didn't see my story reflected in those books. And that lack of a mirrored image left me feeling really alone and misunderstood. So I really wanted to write a book that explored the middle place and that explored these questions of what does it mean to be better, but not all better? And what does it mean to live with the imprints of your disorder? So I explore that question through the lens of my own story. But I also surveyed over 700 people and interviewed 175 people. So I include all of those different perspectives as well to show that this middle place is actually quite populous.
What that must be like to live with, you got anorexia nervosa, um, which I guess the rest of us just know as anorexia. Is that the same? Or is it a specific condition of anorexia?
So it's more or less the same. I say anorexia nervosa because there is also a diagnosis called atypical anorexia, which in some ways is almost more common than anorexia nervosa, but it's less known. And essentially, it's for people who meet all the diagnostic criteria of anorexia, but they're not clinically underweight. So there are actually a lot of folks struggling with very severe food restriction, have very severe physical complications, but for various reasons, their body just doesn't become clinically underweight. So I mention anorexia nervosa just to distinguish it from atypical anorexia.
when it comes to, like, food or eating issues, I understand, like, eating too much, you know what I mean? I love food, I love to cook, I love flavors and combining the different things, and, like, I can really overdo it, and then I've got an overloaded plate, and so the opposite of that is, like, it's so baffling to me because I can't understand it, and anorexia itself, is it classified as a mental health disorder?
It is, yeah.
And, so I guess what goes on in your mind whenever you're 'cause basically you're trying to give yourself, or keep your weight as low as you possibly can, right?
Yes, this is true. I would say that I think a lot of times people think that want individuals sort of slide into eating disorders simply because they want to lose weight, and that's not always the case, although it often becomes about losing weight. But for me, for instance, I just really wanted to stay small. And I was only 12 when I was developing my eating disorder. And so I really didn't know what it was I was struggling with. I didn't have the words to describe my struggles. I thought people with anorexia didn't eat anything at all, and I was still eating. Not much, but I was still eating, and for me, in many ways, I found that the more time passed after my mother passed away, the farther I felt from her. And I had conjured up this idea as a 12-year-old that maybe if I stayed the same size my mom or stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, then I could somehow be closer to her. And so for me, food restriction in some ways was this warped form of time travel. It was never about wanting to be skinny or even about wanting to lose weight, but really about wanting to stay small and safe. And of course, I ended up really descending quite quickly into an eating disorder and ended up feeling farther away than ever from my mother. But it was really interesting to think about that and also to think about how the most accessible memories I had of my mother were of her in a hospital bed losing weight, right? I mean, she really couldn't eat much at the end of her life, so she had lost so much weight, and so there were all of these really interesting parallels between my mom's sickness and my own sickness, and the eating disorder was really this way of just trying to stay small and close to her.
When you're doing that, on the nutrition side, did you feel like you were low energy while you were doing that, or did it feel
I
pretty normal?
No, I definitely felt very low energy. I also had developed obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a common comorbidity of anorexia. And so I was exercising all the time, and I was again only 12. And so my form of exercise was jumping. I would jump everywhere, very high jumps. I would jump in the hallways in school and jump on the way to getting communion in church and jump in the grocery store aisles. I mean, it looked absurd. I remember there was one person in the grocery store who said I looked like a bunny. But I mean, I just was so obsessive about it, and it was fueling this sort of desire to burn calories. And it did become about losing weight, even though it hadn't started off with that. But I was very low energy. I was hospitalized at age 13, and I just had a lot of really bad physical symptoms, very low heart rate, and my body was covered in lanugo, which is the hair that you often see on newborn babies. But in my case, it was a sign of starvation, and it was my body's way of trying to keep me warm. So, very low temperature, just certainly clinically underweight. So, it was really doing a lot of damage to my body. And if I had not been hospitalized that first time, I don't really know what would have happened to me as a 12, 13-year old.
So how did it come about to where you were hospitalized? Did you, I mean, have an accident, or you passed out, or
So, my father had tried taking me to my pediatrician on two separate occasions, and the pediatrician essentially told us that my weight loss was just a passing fad, it was just a phase that I was going through. And turns out that medical doctors still today receive 0 to 2 hours of training typically on eating disorders in med school and residency. So, it's not well understood in the medical community even today, and certainly wasn't back then in the late 90s when I was struggling. And so my father really was at a loss of what to do. And again, we didn't know that I was struggling with anorexia. We knew something was wrong, but my father consulted a family friend who was a nurse, and I ended up interviewing her for the book. But she had said she took one look at me and just knew that I was struggling with an eating disorder. So she recommended that my father take me to Boston Children's Hospital, which had and still today has an eating disorders clinic. And so he took me pretty promptly, and I went, and that night they diagnosed me and admitted me to the medical ward.
Did nobody ever intervene or ask questions at the school? Like the teachers, disciplinarians, anybody in the hallway was like, "Hey, what's going on? Are you eating?"
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people were somewhat afraid to ask me what was going on. I think that certainly they knew that I was grappling with the loss of my mother, and I think in some cases, were concerned because I had gone to school the day after my mother passed away because I was trying to pretend that I was okay and just trying to normalize things in that aftermath of her loss. But I don't think that they really began to ask until they started to kind of see the weight loss, and I was never on the receiving end of any of those questions, and I don't know that my father really was, but certainly I was in and out of the hospital on many occasions, and so once I had been hospitalized once, then the teachers and school administrators knew what I was dealing with, and then they were able to try to help, although I would say that I was lucky to have a lot of great teachers along the way, but it's hard for people to know how to help a young child with an eating disorder. So I think a lot of people were at a loss of what to do or what to say.
So, moving forward a little bit, how did you come out of that? I mean, was it a self decision that you made, or was there an intervention, or
Oh, it was a very long process, and I was hospitalized on 5 separate occasions, so twice in the medical ward at Boston Children's, and then 3 times on the psychiatric ward, which is often where eating disorder patients would go if they relapsed after being on the medical ward. So, I was hospitalized several times, and even though those hospitalizations helped stabilize me physically, I really wasn't able to work through all of the psychological underpinnings. I was only really able to scratch the surface of those in the hospitalizations. So my treatment team decided I needed a higher level of care, and so I ended up going to residential treatment for a year and a half. That is a very long time to be in residential and almost unheard of today. But fortunately, and I write about this in the book, I didn't have as many barriers to treatment as some folks do because I was fortunate to live in a state that essentially sort of paid for my treatment. So the Department of Mental Health in Massachusetts and my public schools district paid for my psychiatric ward stays and paid for my residential treatment. So it was really in residential treatment that I began to slowly move forward in my recovery, and a big part of that was learning to grieve the loss of my mother and to really work through that grief, which I had never really experienced. I had really suppressed that grief for so long, and so working through that and learning to see the eating disorder not as the solution, but as the problem, and recognizing that it was not an effective coping strategy. And so that was a big part of it, coupled with this idea that I needed to be able to reacquaint myself with Mallory, right? Like I needed to get to know who's Mallory because I'd really lost myself in this disorder. And I remember that I just really believed that I needed to be the perfect anorexic and the sickest anorexic. And it breaks my heart to think about that now. But my whole identity was tangled up in the disorder, and so part of recovery was learning to recognize the other parts of myself and to really reconnect with those parts so that I could begin to see myself as more than my disorder.
any mental health, issues that we have, they're really hard to first identify that we have that, even if we are physical, showing, results, of our mental health state and what we're doing to ourselves. Like sometimes we sort of just pack it away and we're like, okay, I'm not going to deal with it. I'm just going to keep doing. It hasn't killed me yet, so I'm going to keep going. For you to be able to identify that you initially now you need to make some steps in overcoming this, which is something, I mean, I'm sure you lived for years and years and years and years. Um, And even, as your book talks about, like, it doesn't completely go away, it's still there, so you're still having to consciously make a decision to overcome it. Whenever you were first starting or, earlier in your career, because I know you're an accomplished, journalist, did it ever, like, hinder you in building up your career at all?
Yeah, that's a great question that no one has actually asked me before. So it really didn't. Fortunately, I was still very high achieving. And this is very true of people with anorexia. They tend to be incredibly high achieving. And that can often mask the eating disorder because people will say, well, she's top of her class, or look at, she's excelling in all of her classes and she's got this great job. But so often, anorexia is a very silent struggle. And I would say that's true of all eating disorders. And so it did not hinder my ability to work, but certainly made it take a lot longer to just get work done. I, in college, did relapse and I fell into a cycle of binge eating and restricting. And that was a very vicious cycle that lasted well over a decade. And so my first job coincided with that cycle. And so it made it harder for me to do my work because a lot of times if I was stressed about being on deadline, that was when I would binge eat. And then the next day I would restrict and not have much energy. And so that made it harder for me personally. But again, I never revealed those particular struggles. And so I was still able to get my work done and be really accomplished. I will say too that at that time in my first job out of college, I did let people know about my eating disorder, although I was writing about it from the perspective of someone who was fully recovered, even though I was still silently struggling. And I was afraid that that vulnerability and that sharing of my story would make people think that I was somehow weaker. And maybe some people did interpret it that way, but I never found that it prevented me from moving forward at all in my work or my career. In a lot of ways, I think sharing my story has really helped advance my work and career.
I was about to say something changed there because obviously you've written an entire book, and now you're going on shows and making the appearances and talking about your experience. And so I guess what made you comfortable? Because I guess in the beginning you sort of felt like, like you said, and people were going to point it out as like this is a weakness, or they're going to be, it's going to damage your hireability or your credibility or whatever. But what happened, I guess, along the way to make you so comfortable to be able to tell your story and your experience?
So I've always identified as a writer, and I really found myself wanting to just write more personal pieces. I started a blog shortly after I graduated from college, and that was when I began to write some personal essays in a more public way. And I was writing those, and I found that people were reaching out to me to say, oh, thank you so much for sharing your story. And it occurred to me that I could really help people to feel less alone if I shared my story. And at the same time that I was writing these pieces, I did feel like there was a bit of a disconnect, which really rubbed me the wrong way as a journalist, because as a journalist, I am all about truth telling and authentic storytelling. And yet, when I was doing this personal writing on the side, or even when I was writing personal essays for publications, I still wasn't speaking to the actual reality of my lived experience, and that I wasn't admitting to the fact that I still was slipping from time to time and that I was still grappling with some aspects of the eating disorder. I sort of framed these pieces around this idea that the eating disorder was something of the past, and that felt safer to do at that time. But the more advanced I got in my career and the more comfortable I got with vulnerability, the more I realized that I really needed to tell a truer story. And that truer story involved really exploring this space called the middle space, right? The middle place. And being able to be honest about the fact that I still do slip, but I no longer see slips as grounds for failure, but rather opportunities for growth. And for the longest time, I thought I was the only one in this place. But when I surveyed these 700 plus people with lived experience for the book, 85% of them said that they could relate to this idea of the middle place. And so I thought, oh, I need to be able to write about this place. And I need people who are in this space to feel seen and heard. And in some ways, it feels like an act of courage to write from that perspective of someone in the middle place, because I think our society tends to prefer protagonists who prevail and who are triumphant. And those are the narratives that get upheld, the ones of people who have really overcome everything and who are now in a much better place. And I can say I'm in a better place, but I've not overcome the disorder with a capital O. So I think we need to really speak truth to just the nuances of recovery. And I'm really intent on exploring those.
Very, very true. I know my listeners have heard me tell the story a billion times, but when I was my first experience or first impression of people that have to go through a recovery of any sort, if you have any kind of mental health issue, or if you have any kind of substance use issues, or some sort of actions that are harming yourself, like there's always the intervention, right? So the family, it's based on like TV and family, or TV and movies and books and things that I've seen or read or heard. And so the media portrays it as, oh, this person's got a problem. Okay, well, let's kill the laugh track first of all. This is honest. This the sitcom's going to take a serious turn for just a few moments, and then the family comes in. They sit around. There's an intervention. They get them into a rehab. They're in there for maybe 30 days, and they go through like the 12-step programs, and then that's it. That's all. Glad we dodged that bullet, and thank God we intervened early, because now it's over and we'll never have to worry about that again. But that's not reality. When you talk to people, like you don't fully, like you said, it's still there. And the term middle place is, I think that's a perfect description of it. Of just being between, you're not fully rid of this thing. It lives with you, but you're not going backwards. I think you've got the cover of Slip behind you, so like I kept looking at the graphic. I love how it descends into, you've got the wide S and then a smaller L, smaller I, smaller P, but you could absolutely see where that would continue on a scale any smaller than that thin P, like you could eventually disappear. Same thing with the S. Eventually, it's just going to be a block, and then So like when you're taking care of yourself, there is a sort of balance that you have to make, and deciding where you're on that scale. And then like you said, that's a decision. Like it doesn't happen. I'm preaching to the choir right now, but like it doesn't happen just naturally. It's something that you have to make a decision for yourself every day. Something else in substance use recovery is that they found that really works for them is something called peer recovery, where it's people that have lived experiences that have gone out of it. They've had a successful recovery, and then they go back into the field helping other people that need that help to get into recovery. Have you found any of that in your journey, or maybe a kinship between people that are going through recovery experiences, maybe not in anorexia?
So I think that certainly there are a lot of peer support groups for folks with eating disorders, and that wasn't as much the case when I was struggling. I found there was more social contagion than anything else when I was in the hospital, where we were sort of sharing tips and tricks on how to be better at our eating disorders. But now I think that there are lots of organizations like the National Alliance for Eating Disorders that have these built in support groups where people really can share stories and try to hold each other up. There also are a lot of eating disorder clinicians who have lived experience, and it used to be pretty taboo for those clinicians to share their eating disorder stories. But in more recent years, it's become more common for them to share their experiences and to talk about how their own journeys really informed their decision to become clinicians. And this is true too of many people who research eating disorders. I do think what's interesting is in talking and interviewing lots of people for my book, I found that a lot of clinicians felt like they couldn't admit to being in the middle place. They found that they really needed to tell folks they were fully recovered in order to be accepted. And that for me was really disheartening in some ways, because I think that there are a lot of people who probably are still grappling with some aspects of their eating disorder, but don't feel like they can admit that as clinicians. So I found that to be the case with a lot of people who I interviewed.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, there's still the stigma around it. You know what I mean? So it's like you might have the bravery to step out and say, "Hey, I had a problem, but yeah, I'm all fixed now. I'm good." No, there's no worry, because I think you worry, and I relate to this as well. Is like you feel like they're going to react in a way to where they don't trust you anymore, or they don't think you're reliable anymore. Like thank you for sharing that, but now my opinion of you is that I may not be able to depend on you because you're still going through this. But yeah, in reality, I mean, like I said, I think everybody sort of is going through something, and it's like the ones that are stepping out and saying, "Hey, I had this issue and I'm dealing with it, and this is something I deal with every day. But look what I've done with myself. Look what I'm making my of my life." Um, that's an incredible thing to do, and mm, for most of us, and I think as a human being, if you live to be a certain age, you know what I mean? Even kids experience, some childhood traumas and things, but if we don't like identify that or say that that's not part of me, it's just something that happened to me. We're kind of avoiding the problem. We're not addressing it anyway. So it's so strange, I'm learning all these different stories and then unraveling some of my own stuff along the way to where it's like the norm should be, well, here's my thing. What's yours? Rather than I had a thing, this is serious, and let me conjure up some courage to tell you what it was. It's rather than why can't we just relate to each other and be like, oh, well, here's what I've dealt with. Well, here's my story of what I dealt with, rather than the Instagram version of our lives where it's all been beaches and great jobs and family and friends.
Yep, I think we live a lacquered life on social media, and I've really tried to just sort of show the tarnishes of my life and the blemishes and the bruises, and I think that that then invites other people to do the same.
That's great. And I know, so you talked earlier about how when you first were talking about your experience, and as a journalist, and you kind of had some fears yourself of, well, people might see you a little bit differently. And you felt maybe kind of a bit of an imposter syndrome because you were writing from the position of someone that's an expert on recovery when you said you weren't fully, or like somebody that's been fully recovered when you were like, I don't think there is a fully recovered. um, when you're teaching journalism now, because you're teaching, future journalists as they're in college right now in Texas, um, do you, has that changed your approach to how you teach them to approach journalism the way they're because of your experiences?
Yes, it very much has. I have developed a couple of interesting courses, and one of them is solutions journalism. So often in journalism, we cover problems, and yet we ignore the solutions that are happening. And so, solutions journalism is really about helping students and professional journalists to think about, okay, what is the problem? We're not going to ignore that, but we can move that storyline forward and look at how people in communities are finding solutions to these problems. And we can consider, is a solution that's playing out in one community, for instance, scalable to another community? And so I think that if we can change our perspective on storytelling from solely being deficit based to being more strength based, that can be really powerful. And similarly, I really try to work with my students on telling more of these restorative narratives. And I encourage them not to just cover the trauma and tragedy and then move on to the next story. I really try to get them to think about messy middles, because so often when I've read stories about eating disorders, the story will spend half of the real estate on sort of the sickness, and then the rest of the story is about how the person's all better. And I remember reading this one story recently that talked about a woman's experience with an eating disorder. And then it moved to a paragraph that said, she's now rosy cheeked and the mother of two children. And I thought, okay, well, one, that doesn't necessarily mean she's recovered. But two, how did she get from point A to point B? And I think that we tend to oversimplify our stories. And often when we're sharing stories verbally, we bypass the middle and we don't really talk about the nitty gritty of it. And in journalism, we don't tend to look at that either. There are certainly some journalists who do a good job of that, but I'm trying to train the next generation of journalists to really explore the nuances and the messiness of that recovery process and of that messy middle so that we can really tell more authentic and holistic stories that get at true beginning, middles, and ongoing endings.
People love to hear, what Joseph Conrad, coined as the hero's journey, right? And so you're at home, you leave home, you're faced with the conflicts, you train under someone else, you get the skills to beat the person. Sometimes you're beat by it, and then you come back and then you conquer them, then you return home changed. and then just repeats that cycle. And we like those feel good stories wherever it's like, okay, they were faced with this problem and they figured out a way to overcome it, and now they're back home and they're good. They're such a better person because of it. But and so many movies cover that very plot where it's that whole cycle. But I think there are still a lot of others where it's the more realistic thing whenever we're talking about recovery or even mental health issues is that you feel like everything's over and now you finally accomplished it and everything's good. You're back home, you're changed, you feel proud of yourself. But the antagonist that you beat in the last frame of the movie is the hand coming back up. They're they're not gone for good. They're coming back. And so it's there still. So the story's not done. Yeah, so I'm glad that you're teaching, your students, to not tell those cyclical, sort of just because it makes us feel good, whenever we hear those stories.
Yeah, and not every story needs a happy ending, and not every story needs a pretty bow either. I used to think I needed to tie up all of my stories with a pretty bow at the end, but a lot of times those are not reflective of reality. Sometimes there is no ending yet, and it's not always tidy. So I think we need to be really careful not to force a happy ending where there isn't one.
Or being told that that is what a happy ending looks like, you know what I mean? Because you can still live with a mental health issue or some sort of, recovery that you're going through and be happy. Like that's there's a way to do that. I know it's not portrayed and it's not taught to us that way because it's usually butterflies and puppies. But sometimes waking up and being like, "Oh, I'm not gonna do that today." And, you you accomplished small things. You brushed your teeth, you took a shower, you made those small accomplishments on a day that you didn't really feel like, doing anything or taking care of yourself. Like you know, that's a small part of happiness that you can take, in that you're making those small accomplishments, compared to the big ones in life.
Yeah, I like to talk about how good story endings are often these quiet crescendos, right? It's like the opening of a door or the opening of a window or, someone placing their hand on you, right? Just sometimes these moments that signify happiness or growth or movement, right? Those can sometimes be worth celebrating. And they're not huge or momentous, but they show something and symbolize something of greater meaning.
So your book, which is coming out in August, and pre-orders are available now, which we'll get to at the end. What would you think was somebody would get out of reading your book?
So I think somebody will really see it as a resource for figuring out how to navigate recovery. I see the primary audience as being individuals with lived experience. And then I also think it'll be quite relevant for caretakers and loved ones and for medical providers and educators. And so I think there's a couple different potential audiences there, but it's not prescriptive, right? So it's not a self-help book where I have workbook exercises or anything like that. It's really more narrative driven and research driven. And so my hope is that people will read it and feel like they are seen and heard. Because again, I think that the vast majority of books on eating disorders are either clinical or written from the perspective of people who have really gotten over their eating disorder. And so many people I've talked to have said, I just don't feel like I'm there yet. And I don't know if I ever will be fully recovered. And I don't really know how to talk about that. So I hope the book will give people just more language for talking about their recovery and give them the space and freedom to be able to celebrate small wins in their recovery as opposed to thinking that they're not good enough because they haven't achieved the fullest expression of it.
What do you think somebody who doesn't have, a firsthand experience, or know anybody that's dealt with, an eating disorder would get out of reading your book?
Yeah, so I think about this a lot because I'm a mom of two young children, and I, of course, know a lot about eating disorders, but there are so many parents who may not really understand the warning signs for eating disorders. And I think that a lot of children can fall through the cracks because people don't necessarily know what to look for. And so I certainly hope that parents, but really anyone of any age, can read this book and really learn a lot more about eating disorders because they are so widely misunderstood. And there are so many misconceptions about who does and doesn't struggle with eating disorders. So in the book, I interview men, I interviewed LGBT. LGBTQ plus community. I interviewed people of all different ages and races and ethnicities. And so I think that's really important because a lot of times eating disorders are simply chalked up as a white teenage girl issue, and they're simply not. And so I think that folks reading this book will be able to really come to understand eating disorders more. And my hope is that it ends up dispelling a lot of misconceptions. I'll also say too that I try to always write about universal themes like motherhood and loss and grief and illness and recovery. So those are all interwoven in the book as well. So while it's primarily about eating disorders, I hope that there'll be other points of relatability for people who don't have lived experience with an eating disorder.
That's why I just love reading in general, is being able to put myself in somebody else's shoes, even if it's somebody's life I can't relate to at all. It's being able to understand and have empathy. And, in some small way, I mean, this is why stories have prevailed throughout, the history of humankind, is that we find something valuable in them, right? And so either we learn about ourselves or we're like, oh, well, this will be useful if this ever happens in my life. Or if I ever meet somebody like this will, this is how I communicate. And they stick with us. I mean, like we all have our favorite stories, and they're our favorites for a reason. They impacted us in some way. So it's incredible. I'm glad that your book exists, for one. I'm glad that you came through a very successful recovery and that you continue to do so and help shine a light on this, because I don't even know if, like you said, there are research institutes that are around the country, but if somebody was dealing with an eating disorder, like where would they even go for help?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there are a lot of barriers to care in terms of just finances and also geographic locations. There are some states that have very few treatment centers for eating disorders, but there are some good places to start. And so I mentioned the National Alliance for Eating Disorders. That's a great place that really tries to connect individuals with treatment centers and with different support systems. So I think that that's a really great resource to turn to. There's the Multi Service Eating Disorders Association, which also offers support for those who are struggling and for caregivers. And so there are some national organizations that are doing good work, but also there are many great eating disorder specific clinicians located around the country. And I think the extent to which someone can see someone who specializes in eating disorders is always going to be best, just because those folks typically know what to look for and how to best treat people with eating disorders.
With you and your experience, both professionally and your personal experience, and what you've done, I mean, obviously, you're putting this all together, and you're trying to deliver messages to other people who have suffered from some very similar things. Let's say for that, that teenage version of Mallory, where, you were still trying to keep yourself the same size because you imagined yourself, if you didn't change, then your relationship with your mom wouldn't change and she would somehow be there, and you're being hospitalized. What is a long-term solution for that version of Mallory, for people that are going through that right now? Because you're not the only one. I mean, it's a pretty unique experience, but still, there are so many people that are suffering from that. What do you think is a long-term solution that we could provide for those children?
I think one long term solution would be honestly to get more medical training on eating disorders. I think about how if my pediatrician had recognized the warning signs and had intervened earlier on, I could be today in a very different place, which almost gives me the chills to think about. But medical doctors get 0 to 2 hours of training on eating disorders. And that's mind boggling when you consider the fact that 30 million Americans will struggle with an eating disorder at some point in their lifetime. And we know from research that the earlier someone receives help, the better the prognosis. And so I think, particularly when you think about children, a lot of times there are children who are just not getting the care or resources or treatment that they need. And so I think that that really could change if we were to get more training in med schools. And that's a systemic issue that's going to take a long time to change. But there's so much emphasis on obesity. And of course, there can be crossover between obesity and eating disorders, but there's so much more emphasis on that in graduate school and med school than there is on eating disorders. And I think that that needs to change so that more children like me can get the help that they need and maybe never have to descend into their eating disorder. I'll just say lastly, I talk about the middle place as being this space in between acute sickness and full recovery, but I also think that there is a middle place between sort of a trigger and one's descent into an eating disorder. And that's a place that I think we really need to pay more attention to because it is a place where we could intervene and where we could help more people before it actually turns into a diagnosed eating disorder.
And the book, of course, is Slip. It's available in August, but it's actually available for pre-order now. How do people pre-order your book now?
Yeah, so you can pre-order it wherever you buy books. So Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local independent bookstore. And I always tell people if you're planning to order it, might as well pre-order it because pre-orders just really help authors and they also help bookstores to know how many copies to stock. So I want this to reach as many people as possible because I really wanted to help as many people as possible. So I hope that your listeners will check it out.
Also, if people wanted to keep up with you, I know you do have a website that people can go to.
Yes. So my website is Mallary Tenore Tarpley, just my full name. I also have a weekly newsletter where I offer up best practices and tips for writing, and that's just Mallary, Mallary.substack.com.
Mallory, thank you. Thanks for spending some time here and to help, spread experience and knowledge and everything that you've been through and educate people for one, on that this is an actual thing that happens, and two, for people that are actually going through this and maybe don't feel like there's a support system out there, or they don't feel encouraged to talk or reach out. And I think you're giving them that. You're providing a lot of value for both of us as people that don't experience that and people that do, and making that Venn diagram where we can meet in the middle and understand each other and have a little bit more empathy and more resources and help for people that are going through these issues. So thank you for that.
Yes, of course. Thank you for your interest.
No, yeah, of course. It's terribly interesting. And I'm going to pre order your book and definitely going to give that a read as well. Um, and thank you for listening and for watching this episode. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find us on all of your major podcasting platforms from Apple, Spotify, iHeart. There's many, many more. And if you're listening to this as an audio podcast platform, then you can also find us on YouTube. If you heard Mallory say something here today that was incredibly interesting, or like somebody that is experiencing some of the things that she's talking about that they could really hear this message, and they need to hear this message, share this episode with them. That's the quickest way that we can get the information out to the people that need to hear it. And I mean, it obviously grows the show. We love, subscribing and commenting, all that. But the most important thing is that we're getting the information to the people that need it so that they know that there's resources out there. They know there's help, and they know that they're not the only one in the world that's struggling with this one thing. And so what Mallory's talked about here, and of course, her book is available, her website is up there. There are resources for people to reach out to where they can find help, and sharing this episode with them helps in just full circle so we can build a full support system for everybody that needs recovery. So thank you for listening to this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.